Hello, we're going to talk about how biology is climate control. Life creates the conditions for life. We have a livable planet because we have a living planet. Species tend to create the conditions in which they might thrive. For an example, blue jays and squirrels both depend on acorns to live, and they end up hiding acorns around in different places, and they hide more acorns than they eat over the winter. And when they hide an acorn in the ground, and when it sprouts into an oak tree, then it yields more acorns so that blue jay populations and squirrel populations might grow. This is an example of how the gene pool, the genetic bank that is the blue jay species, wants to extend its genes as far into the future as it can. And the genetic bank that is the species of squirrels wants to extend its genes as far into the future as it possibly can, so that it's in the interest of the squirrels or the blue jays to plant more acorns than they eat. So that way down the road, there are more oak trees and more acorns for them to live on. This is an example at the species level, how the species is kind of hardwired to create the conditions in which it might thrive. A forest is the same way. So a forest is many species. A forest is more than one species, but as a forest, it has the inclination and the ability to create the conditions in which it might thrive. The forest, for example, the trees have many ways of interacting with the water cycles. So, for example, a forest, when it rains, the forest absorbs water. The forest is a sponge. That way, it keeps the rain from getting away. If the rain runs off too fast, then the forest and the trees won't have as much water. So the forest soaks up that rain. Furthermore, the trees, like all plants, they have roots in the ground, so they condition or nurture the soil so that the soil becomes more able to be a sponge. And another thing is the trees of the forest tend to transpire water. Transpire means the water goes in through the roots, up through the trunk or the stem, out through the leaves. When the water goes out through the leaves, it evaporates. When it evaporates, it has a cooling effect. So the forest has the ability and the inclination to transpire water in such a way that it has a cooling effect. Furthermore, the forest has a bunch of water in it. Plants are on average about 50% water. So that water is slow to warm up and slow to cool down. So it provides a buffer for temperatures. It keeps it from getting too hot or too cold. And so many ways in which the forest tends to create the conditions in which it might thrive. Furthermore, the forest it has a number of plant species. Those plant species have symbiotic relationships or mutually beneficial relationships with fungi, with microbes, with bacteria, etc., so that the forest is building those relationships with other species so that the plant species might thrive. So we have many ways in which life creates the conditions for life. We have a livable planet because we have a living planet, as opposed to what? You cannot explain the moderate climate that we have on planet Earth solely by reference to physics and chemistry. Especially, the physicists have taken over the climate conversation, and they want to tell us that CO2 is the sole cause of global warming, and that we need to hyper focus on CO2 so that we can lower the CO2 emissions, lower the CO2 content of the atmosphere, and thereby lower the temperatures. What they're missing, what they're neglecting, what they are seemingly blind to, is the impact of living systems on our temperatures, the impact of living systems on our climate. It's those living systems that tend to create the conditions that are favorable to themselves. And as a result, the greenhouse effect is a good thing. Not that you want too much of it, and we need to think of what we can do to have a moderate greenhouse effect, not an overly, not a greenhouse effect that heats up temperatures too much. But life makes it such that, according to the Australian soil scientist and climate scientist Walter Jenner, he says that the Earth is 22 degrees Celsius warmer as a result of the greenhouse effect, as a result of the living systems on our planet. We wouldn't, for the sake of Americans, 22 degrees Celsius is about 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. What if our summers were 50 degrees or 45 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than they are now? An average summer day would be 30 degrees instead of 70 degrees. And what if our winters were 50 degrees cooler than they are now? The average day would be like sub-zero in Fahrenheit terms. We don't want that. So let's talk about the, I have a slideshow to show. I prepared some slides. And let's go to this view. Let's go instead to this view. Oh, I want to make that a little bit better for you. I'm going to do the slideshow view, and there we have it, the slideshow view. So biology is climate control. So what I've been talking about, living systems tend to create the circumstances and the conditions in which they might thrive. We have a livable planet because we have a living planet. Life creates the conditions for life. Now, let's talk about the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is such that the only thing, I should have added a couple more items here. We'll talk about those. But the prevailing climate conversation, the dominant narrative, is all about greenhouse gases. They want you to think that CO2 is the main thing driving climate change, and that if we could just control CO2, we would be in much better shape. Two things that they're neglecting is the effect of hot surfaces and the effects of plant cover. So look at the picture here. There's a desert on the top of the picture, and there's a moderate temperate climate on the bottom picture. The desert has hot surfaces, and when the sun shines on those hot surfaces, it radiates a lot of heat back up into the atmosphere. The temperate climate that we're talking about on the bottom picture, when the sun, it's raining in this picture, but even if the sun were out, when the sun shines on those plants, then what happens is, for one thing, the plants cast shade. And the plants also transpire water. A tree of average size transpires many gallons per day of water. When it transpires, that means it evaporates. When it evaporates, that means things cool down. So the greenhouse effect is not just about greenhouse gases. The greenhouse effect is also the presence or absence of hot surfaces and the presence or absence of plant cover. Next slide. Now here's the dominant narrative about climate change. This is what you read about in the New York Times. This is what you see on National Geographic or on YouTube. This is what you read about in the United Nations. And I've oversimplified it a little bit, but not by much. The dominant narrative about climate change is that fossil fuel, in the beginning, everything was fine. But then humans came along and started emitting CO2 by the prodigious burning of fossil fuels. It's true, but let's just look at this narrative. It's not all about facts. It's about what stories are they telling us. And stories have challenges and conflict and heroes and villains. Number one, fossil fuels emit CO2. Number two, CO2 causes warming. Yes, CO2 probably does cause warming. How much it causes, we could talk about, but the narrative is fossil fuels emit CO2. CO2 causes warming. Warming is an existential threat. Even 1.5, on average, even 1.5 degrees Celsius, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, is going to be an existential threat to nature and human civilization. Number four, the only way to stop warming is to lower CO2 emissions. The emphasis on the word only. And they don't say this, but a narrative is defined, or a campaign is defined by what they emphasize, what they say repeatedly. They know that humans are not going to believe something upon hearing it once. They know that humans are going to respond to something that they hear over and over and over and over and over, and they're not going to respond to something that they only hear on rare occasion. So rarely do the mainstream climate media, the scientific organizations, mention anything other than CO2 emissions as a cause of warming, and therefore rarely do they mention anything other than CO2 emission, other than lowering CO2 emissions as a way to stop global warming. Item number 5 in the dominant narrative is that solar power and wind power will lower CO2 emissions. That's dubious, but let's move on. Number 6, natural solutions are secondary and even quaint. In other words, we're not going to talk very much about natural solutions. We're not going to talk very much about the need for more plant cover. We're not going to talk very much, if at all, about the need to restore our deserts so that there's not so much desert sand causing the existence and the prevalence of solar-powered hot plates. A desert is a solar-powered hot plate. A forest is a solar-powered air conditioner. Even a grassland. There's something in between deserts and forests, and it's a grassland. A grassland is typically an area that doesn't get a whole lot of rainfall, but it gets enough to support a grassland, and it gets enough because it supports a grassland. It supports grazing herds of animals, and but you don't hear very much about that in the dominant narrative. So let's move on to the next slide. Now, I've been talking about the dominant narrative, and I'm going to talk now about the alternative point of view. The alternative point of view is that plants cool the climate dramatically. They cast shade, they transpire water. Evaporating water has a tremendous cooling effect. Step out of the shower, it's cold, give me a towel. Step out of the swimming pool, it's cold, give me a towel. If you're sweating a little bit, either because of exercise or hot weather, then a breeze comes along, it feels cool because evaporating water, evaporating sweat, cools the air and the surfaces from which it's evaporating. We're talking about an alternative point of view that emphasizes how plants cool the climate, and evaporating water is part of that because plants produce water, water evaporates. Item number 2, plants, water cycles, and ecosystems would have the effect of drawing down carbon. If we would give them half a chance, we've eliminated about half of the ecosystems, about half of the biomass, about half of the biodiversity in the last 5,000 years. If we were to work to replace those, the biomass and the biodiversity, then we would have more cooling. We would be drawing down more carbon. We would be storing more carbon because that's what ecosystems do. They store carbon if they're allowed to grow, if they're allowed to diversify, if they're allowed to increase in biomass. Item number 3, good soil stores carbon. Not only do ecosystems store carbon, but good soil stores carbon. Item number 4, farms can serve as functioning ecosystems. So we're talking about how functioning ecosystems cast shade, they store carbon, they store water. Farms can be functioning ecosystems. Farms don't have to be ecologically destructive. Most are because of public policy, but it doesn't have to be that way. And item number 5, we can cool our climate quickly by natural means without jeopardizing decarbonization. In other words, somebody might say, okay, this is fine, this is good, this is nice, but we still have to decarbonize. Okay, Mr. Obsessive, but we're going to ecosystems will decarbonize better than anything else, partly because ecosystems cycle more carbon. According to MIT Climate Focus, there's if you type in the search term, how much carbon how much carbon is cycled by nature versus industry, it will tell you that 10 times as much carbon is cycled by nature as compared with industry. So why aren't we focusing on increasing nature? If we've decreased nature by half in the last 5,000 years, why don't we talk about how we can increase nature so nature, as it grows, can draw down more carbon? I need to decide whether I'm going to talk about insects. I will say this about insects. Here's a quote from the book Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. It says, most people have a negative attitude about all insects as they do about germs and bacteria, but for every pest species, there are between 1,400 and 1,700 species of insects that are beneficial to humans. Without those beneficial insects, food webs and ecosystems would collapse. Now, it seems like I just changed the subject from how ecosystems cool to insects. But I'm talking about ecosystems, or I'm talking about insects for just a minute, because insects are part of ecosystems. Insects are a vital part of ecosystems. And the way we do farming kills way more insects than we have to. We could do pest control without killing all these insects. If we were willing to do pest control biologically and naturally, then we would have a lot more insects. Insects are a vital part of ecosystems. If we want to grow back our ecosystems, then we need to stop killing them. That's part of the reason we have eliminated half the biomass in the last, how much? The last 5,000 years, because we were busy killing things. We're busy killing insects with insecticides. We're busy killing plants with herbicides. We're busy killing fungi with fungicides. We don't have to do that. We are locked into a public policy that encourages that. And why we have that is another conversation, but it doesn't have to be that way. We could have farms that support human health and nature, and let's do it that way. I'm going to flip through a few slides here about insects. And let me talk briefly about the plant health pyramid. So one way to grow back our ecosystems so that ecosystems can directly cool the climate and ecosystems can provide food and water, and the ecosystems can directly cool the climate. And what am I trying to say here? They can store carbon. So ecosystems can store carbon. Ecosystems can cool the climate, and farms can be ecosystems. And a big part of that is the plant health pyramid. So the plant health pyramid is developed and offered by John Kempf of Advancing Eco-Agriculture. This photo is used, this image is used by permission. The plant health pyramid is where we nurture plants that are so healthy that they are resistant, completely resistant, according to John Kemp. If you have healthy plants, they can be completely resistant to pests and pathogens, to insects and diseases. I encourage you to look up a video called, the plant, just Google Plant Health Pyramid, John Kemp, Kempf. Very smart guy. We need to learn from John Kemp about what he's doing. And let me flip over here. I'm going to flip through a few slides that I don't strictly need. And let's talk a little bit about how all this relates to human health. So we want to encourage and nurture ecosystems. We want to grow our biomass because growing biomass absorbs carbon. Growing biomass and growing ecosystems filter water. They make water clean. They regulate temperatures. They make sure the temperatures don't get too hot or too cold. Like in a desert, it gets really hot in the day, really cold at night, really hot in the summer, really cold in the winter. It doesn't have to be that way. We can restore our deserts to the grasslands and savannas that they once were. But let's talk so we want to talk about how our farms can be instruments in growing the biomass that we need. So let's talk about, and let's talk about how our farms can grow that biomass and at the same time make for healthier food. So this says that the USDA National Nutrient Database has calcium and vitamin A in broccoli dropping 54% and 75% respectively between 1975 and 2010. Over the same time period, levels of iron and vitamin A have fallen 60% and 40%. That's from Cows Save the Planet by Judy Schwartz, my friend and mentor. And Cows Save the Planet is one of those. I wish everybody who's promoting solar power and wind power would read Cows Save the Planet, because it'll give you a glimpse into a world in which we can dramatically cool our temperatures while restoring life on Earth, partly with livestock. That's another conversation. But the problem is that nutritional value has dropped dramatically. And so let's have another couple of quotes related to the dramatic drop in nutritional value, and then we'll talk about how to solve this problem. According to Graham Said, an author educator on nutrition and agriculture in Australia, some nutritionists estimate that the food we eat today has just 30% of the nourishment of what our grandparents ate as children. A major reason, says Said, is declining soil quality. So we need to talk about how to restore soil quality, which is, when we talk about restoring ecosystems, a vital part, a central part of that conversation is how to restore our soil, because soil is the foundation of most functioning ecosystems, especially those on land. Soil is not going to be a vital part of well, it is kind of a vital part of ocean ecosystems, because the bad things we're doing to the soil flows into the waterways, and then into the oceans. But so it says the major reason site says is declining soil quality, although the way we process, prepare, and transport food also plays a vital role. So if we're going to have better food and at the same time restore ecosystems so that we can grow biomass, so that, as biomass grows, it stores carbon. And we can do that while growing much better food everywhere. It is a myth that industrial agriculture grows. It is a myth that industrial agriculture feeds the world. Insofar as industrial agriculture feeds anybody, it yields junk food. Corn, soy, wheat, rice, oats are usually processed in such a way as to remove the nutrient value from them, and it results in bad food. Next quote says, "Those of us who can afford it, buy organic to avoid chemical residues. But perhaps the bad stuff in food is only part of the problem, the other being some of the good stuff is missing." In other words, yes, toxic pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides all play a role in making food less healthy. But part of what makes food less healthy is what is not in the food. If it's true, as it says back here, that broccoli has dropped in calcium and vitamin A by 54 and 75%, and the levels of iron and vitamin A have fallen 60 and 40%. In other words, somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3, usually more than half, of the nutrient value of any given nutrient has come out of our foods in the last 50 years or so, 50 to 75 years. I don't know about you. My grandparents were born in the early 1900s and the late 1800s, so that dates me. But what I'm saying is that when they were children, in other words, 100 years ago or less, when they were children, their food had about twice the nutrients of our food, about twice the nutrients of vitamin A, calcium, iron. So anyway, it mentions vitamin A twice here, so I'm not quite sure how that falls out. But anyway, so what matters is not just the pesticides on the food, but the the vitamins, the calcium, the iron, the vitamin A, vitamin C that are not in our food that should be there. So you have to eat 2 or 3 times as much of the same thing to get the same nutritional value. Now, one important part of that whole story is, don't you hate it when that happens? It'll come back to me maybe. So, okay, this slide has to do with the soil food web. And I want to talk with you a minute about what the soil food web is: a high functioning underground ecosystem that delivers nutrients to the plants. Plants need 17 essential nutrients. And the way they get those 17 essential nutrients is that they're delivered to the plant by the soil. If you don't have a high functioning soil food web, then the plant is not going to get the nutrients it needs. Now, you can get nutrients out of a bag, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients out of a bag, but getting nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium from a bag is not as good for the soil. It's not as good for the plant. The plant, it degrades the soil. The plant doesn't operate as efficiently. And John Kemp of Advancing Eco-Agriculture says that when you put on nitrogen fertilizer, it actually diminishes the amount of nitrogen available to the plant. Plus, even insofar as the plant does get nitrogen, you increase plant growth, but just because you increase the growth of the plant doesn't mean that that plant has the same amount of calcium or the same amount of vitamin C, vitamin A, or iron as it would have if the plant were acquiring nitrogen by natural means through a high functioning soil food web. So let's look at the soil food web and see what we have here. So the soil food web, this image is from Matt Powers, used by permission. Over here on the left, the soil food web really starts with the sun. The sun shines on the plant. The plant takes carbon dioxide and water and turns it into simple sugars, and then it takes the simple sugars and turns them into complex carbohydrates and uses those to synthesize amino acids and proteins and fats and then plant secondary metabolites. And all of that happens, and then the plant roots, then at some point the plant roots inject or exude simple sugars into the soil, and then bacteria come and feed off of those, and fungi come and feed off of those. And when the bacteria and the fungi are getting the nutrients they need, then they're delivering to the plant the nutrients that the plants need, including phosphorus that they get from rocks, including nitrogen that it gets from, well, there's many sources of nitrogen in the soil. Not least of all, bacteria and fungi are in the business of synthesizing nitrogen. Nitrogen itself is an element, but it comes packaged in molecules, and those molecules can include nitrates, those molecules can include nitrites, those molecules can include ammonium, and these ammonium molecules, these nitrate molecules, are synthesized by the bacteria and the fungi, and they also take those and use those to synthesize amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and when bacteria and fungi synthesize amino acids for the plant, it's very efficient for the plant, because the plant can synthesize amino acids, but not as efficiently. You can save the plant energy if the amino acids, if the nitrogen gets delivered to the plant in the form of the amino acids, so that the plant does not itself have to perform that process of synthesis. So nitrogen gets delivered to the plant by the soil food web. Phosphorus gets delivered to the plant by way of bacteria and fungi that solubilize the phosphorus. In other words, they putting it into form that's kind of soluble, and then the plant can then use that to package the phosphorus in forms that it needs. For example, bones are made largely of calcium phosphate, so you need you need the phosphorus in the form of calcium phosphate to have teeth and bones. You need phosphorus is used is a key component of molecules called ADP and ATP, which are their storehouses of energy. And so anything that cells do that requires energy is probably utilizing those phosphorus-based molecules. Phosphorus is also a key ingredient of amino acids and proteins. So anyway, the plant needs a lot of things, and not least of all, it needs the phosphorus that is delivered to it most efficiently and most effectively in the form of living things that come from the soil food web. You need that soil food web in order for the plant to function. So I've already told you about this. And so how do we get all this? This slide is about how to make healthy soil. It's like, okay, what are we gonna do? What's the call to action? What are the inputs that we need so that we get the outcomes that we want? And the way to do that is to practice the principles of soil health as set forth by Gabe Brown in his book, Dirt to Soil. We want to limit disturbance. This means to limit tillage. This means to limit tillage is physical disturbance. We want to limit chemical disturbance also. Chemical disturbance is chemical fertilizers. Chemical disturbance is herbicides and fungicides, insecticides. Number two, we want to armor the soil surface, which is another way of saying use mulch. Mulch can be wood chips or leaves. Mulch can be crop residue, but don't let any soil be bare. You want some sort of organic matter to cover the soil. Wherever you don't have plants covering the soil, you want organic matter covering the soil. That's what Gabe means by number two, armor the soil surface. Number three, build diversity. Diversity is like when you saw the soil food web, there's a lot of diversity in a robust soil food web. In a thriving soil food web, it has a lot of diversity. So you want that diversity. How do you get diversity in the soil food web? You want a diversity of living plants. And you want a diversity of animals. And that's what items 4 and 5 of the soil food web are about. Item number 3, build diversity. Diversity in the soil, diversity in the plants, diversity in the animals, diversity in the fungi. Item number 4, living roots in the ground. This is speaking to farmers. It speaks to everybody, but living roots in the ground as opposed to what? Living roots in the ground as opposed to bare ground. When your ground is bare, it's like you wouldn't starve your livestock. You wouldn't deprive your livestock of feed for 6 months. That person who doesn't feed or water their livestock for 6 months is some combination of cruel and stupid. That's what we're doing to our soil food web, our underground livestock. That's what we're doing when we have bare ground that's lying fallow and we're not feeding our underground livestock. Have living roots in the ground. And that's number 4. And item number 3, make it a diversity of living roots. And item number 5, integrate animals. This is also speaking to farmers and people with a landscape. If you don't have livestock, you can't easily integrate animals, but you can integrate smaller animals in the form of, allow worms and all the microbes, the insects that crawl underneath the ground, your moles and your birds and your small mammals all have a role to play in your livestock. You don't want to completely eradicate them. You might want to move them from place to place from time to time by attracting them elsewhere, etc. But you don't want to eradicate the animal life under any circumstances. But especially if you're a farmer and you're a rancher and you have the livestock, then you rotate those livestock from place to place. Let them graze maybe once a year on your crop fields. Let them graze your cover crops. And, so integrate animals. For more details, look all this up in Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. So the conclusion of this is that, so what we're doing, I've been taking a deep dive into some of the details, but the conclusion of this is that, the dominant narrative is focused on CO2. Almost the narrative that's focused on CO2 is almost certainly oversimplified. It can't be all about CO2. It can't be all about greenhouse gases. Plants and ecosystems cool the climate quickly and safely. This is not something you're going to read about with any regularity at all in the New York Times or in the United Nations or any other of the dominant corporate funded sources. Number two, we can control, and as part of, we need to restore our ecosystems in order to quickly and safely cool the climate. Part of that is to have a different relationship with insects. We can control insects without indiscriminately spraying pesticides. The pesticides expose the farmer to toxic chemicals that cause cancer, and there are neurotoxins, etc. We can control our insects with a biological control. We can kind of encourage and nurture an ecosystem that includes predatory insects, beneficial insects that then control the pest species. And item number 3 here, you can't see it, I'll show you. Item number 3 here is that only healthy soil can efficiently and reliably deliver essential nutrients to the plant. And that's, we're talking about restoring ecosystems. If we're going to restore our ecosystems and increase our biomass so as to cool the climate, then we need to start with healthy soil, especially on land. We need to start with healthy soil. So there you have it. That is, I think, the best summary I can give you. The last slide is that biology is climate control. Life creates the conditions for life. We have a livable planet because we have a living planet. We especially have to pay attention to our farmland because although most farmland is privately owned, it has public consequences. We need to come alongside our farmers. We need to support our farmers with education, with asking, working with them, saying what do they need. We need to start our own small farms. We need to practice the principles of soil health in our own home landscape and in our small gardens. And that is the way that we will have a living planet, and that's the only way we will have a sufficiently living planet, that we will have a livable planet. And besides, it's fun. It's fun, it's healthy. This is how we're going to grow good food. It's all upside, it's no downside. So thank you very much for joining me. Have a great day.